Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. It encompasses how we validate knowledge, the distinction between belief and opinion, and so on. In other words, how do we know what we know, and how can we justify what we know? And perhaps most importantly, it tries to establish what methods might be used to gain knowledge and what modes of thought might lead us astray. It's a somewhat ugly word, but an even uglier term is feminist epistemology. Now, feminist epistemology is a collection of theories that attempts to explain modes of knowing from a female perspective. The term itself is a self-inflicted contradiction. In order for it to have any legitimate meaning, you would have to accept, a priori, a stereotypical view of female cognition, or at the very least hold the view that men and women simply don't think alike. This view, it seems to me, contradicts directly a core tenet of feminism itself. A trivial repudiation of feminist epistemology would be to simply point out the contradiction on which it's founded. Such an obvious cognitive deficit in most other fields would have been sufficient to consign this particular epistemology to the catalogue of failed notions. Sadly, feminist studies departments, typically known as gender studies departments, are little isolated islands of ideology. They have become insulated, often indulged, intellectual ghettos within the academy. So instead of this infant epistemology being consigned to the history books, it has thrived, mutated, and branched paradisciplines. Paradiscipline is a term used by the philosopher Noretta Kirchie in her paper Feminist Epistemology, Stalking an Undead Horse. These paradisciplines include such things as black epistemology and queer epistemology. There is lesbian ethics and feminist morality, feminist aesthetics, and even feminist musicology, a field that music lovers in particular should avoid at all costs. This mode of thinking is seeping into the sciences at the interdisciplinary boundaries, where we find such things as ethnomathematics, Afrocentric science, feminist methodology, feminist glaciology, and even feminist geology, all of which claim legitimacy and seek to establish themselves within the academy. Worse still, these paradisciplines have begun to compete for science funding and have had an influence on science education in schools. There are very good reasons to believe that feminist epistemology has become a chronic and debilitating condition within the social sciences, and it certainly renders most feminist theories devoid of any substance. But to understand why that is the case, we need to consider carefully what is to be found within the pernicious core of feminist epistemology, and how it redefines some very important common terms and warps them to fit its own specific narrative. The first claim made by feminist epistemology is that knowing depends on the gender of the knower. Let's look at a philosophical statement. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Now, what is the gender of the thinker? We know the gender of the philosopher who first made the original statement, Descartes. But what is the gender of this particular thinker? We have no way of knowing. And if we did, what difference would it make to the fact of the matter, that if we think, we must at least exist? So we can dispense with the notion that gender has any epistemic value. It is all too easy to mistake the feminist use of the term objectivity to mean the same as the conventional use of the term. But objectivity in feminist epistemology has nothing in common with the usual meaning of the term. In fact, it is antithetical to the traditional meaning. It is the view of the feminist that observers should always be emotionally connected to what they're studying. Subjective experience should be maintained at all costs. That intuition has primacy over rationality and disinterested observation. Now, I use the term disinterested in the British sense, of meaning detached or apart from, rather than uninterested. These feminist notions are dressed collectively as objectivity. In feminist epistemology, knowledge is always a matter of perspective. It's tethered to context. Skepticism is spurned. Personal perception rules. And universalism, one of the key tenets of science, is replaced with standpoint theory, a theory which says that observations are always to be understood as a product of the culture, gender, ethnicity, and even the class of the observer who made them, that no activity can be or should be considered as a disinterested inquiry. Quite the contrary. A commitment to political and social outcomes is a reasonable expectation. Everything, after all, revolves around the standpoint of the observer, and what a privileged observer she seems to be. Another serious flaw is that feminist epistemology is not actually an epistemology at all, in the same way that feminist objectivity is not actually objectivity. Feminist epistemology doesn't concern itself much with trivial matters of truth, dull definitions, and establishing first principles. When discourse moves towards that particular direction, female ways of knowing are invoked, and the rhetoric meanders poetically towards the mystical. It has no independent existence. Its sole function is to support a particular worldview. Its function is nothing more than the rationalization of feminism itself. There is a long history of cogent criticisms of feminist epistemology. Gross and Levet in Higher Superstition, Summers in Who Stole Feminism, as well as Patty and Kirchie in Professing Feminism. Each considered the epistemology from their own fields of science and philosophy, and eviscerated the feminist epistemological project. But feminist epistemology has proven itself invulnerable to external censure. It has a long history of evading criticism. It chooses carefully who occupies its conference platforms. Feminists review each other's papers, and they write glowing recommendations for each other's literary efforts, all the while carefully insulating themselves from potentially damaging critique. Cassandra Pinnock, in her essay published in a 1994 issue of Philosophy of Science, wrote, and I quote, "No feminist epistemology is worthy of the name, because such an epistemology fails to escape well-known vicissitudes of epistemic relativism. The central thesis of this article is that feminist epistemology should not be taken seriously." In conclusion, I will leave you with one final polemical remark made by Radcliffe Richards, the author of The Skeptical Feminist. He wrote, "If it really could be shown that patriarchal thinking not only played a crucial role in the scientific revolution, but is also necessary for carrying out scientific inquiry as we know it, that would constitute the strongest argument for patriarchy that I can think of. I continue to believe that science, even white, upper-class, male-dominated science, is one of the most important allies of oppressed people." Thank you for listening.